I see him as a pretty pivotal figure. I mean, in the sense that he was really the first to kind of systematically employ a demonizing, othering, stigmatizing language vis-a-vis his Democratic opponents in a way that had not been done, for quite some time. I mean, he was really the first political figure who just completely broke the civil peace that had prevailed, since during the most of the post-war decades. So I do see him as a really kind of important figure in this move towards a hyper-partisan, no-holds-barred kind of politics that just seems to escalate every day.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean Fettig. I'm a political scientist, and I'm interested in how our government and our politicians influence our lives, but also how our personal stories influence our politics. In this podcast, I may focus on topics in the news, but this is not punditry. Instead, I dive deep into issues and stories with my guests, behind the headlines, beyond the basic narrative that is often crafted by the media and our politicians, to help us better understand each other and why we think and feel the ways we do. Welcome to the second of a three-part series I'm doing here on Deep Dive that seeks to understand what underpins the, let's call it Trumpism movement in the United States, who these voters are and what motivates them, and then how that fits into a broader global shift we're seeing away from liberal democracy. Last week, I spoke to Arlie Hochschild about her book, Strangers in Their Own Land, and what she experienced when she embedded herself in rural Louisiana, what would become deep Trump country, to understand the paradox of super conservative folks and their support for environmental policy that does tangible harm to them, their families, and their communities. And this week, I'm talking to Dr. Philip Gorski, a professor and sociologist at Yale University, and the co-author of the book, The Flag and the Cross, which is the focus of our conversation today. I'm trying to understand another seeming paradox. Why self-identified Christians align themselves so closely with Trump, and now by extension the contemporary Republican Party, who, for all intents and purposes, is not a true Christian. He certainly hasn't lived his life in accordance to Scripture. And so I want to know how Christians square this alliance and this allegiance, how we got here, and if there's any chance that this relationship could be short-circuited. And I suppose, if so, how? Let's do a deep dive. Dr. Gorski, I appreciate you being here. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me on, Sean.
Yeah, absolutely. So recently, over the past few months, I've read 3 books that I think individually help to explain the state and influence of nationalism in contemporary geopolitics. And taken together, I think they paint a fascinating global picture of a phenomenon that I think we're still struggling to understand, and today's conversation specifically in the United States. So those 3 books are Strangers in Their Own Land with Arlie Hochschild, who I talked to last week, Go Back to Where You Came From by Sasha Polikow-Saransky, who I'm talking to next week. And then the reason I've invited you here today is your book with Samuel Perry, The Flag and the Cross, which I think goes a long way, if not all the way, toward explaining this, movement through the lens of Christianity. But let's boil the frog slowly here. So before we get to some of the nuance, I'm wondering if you could just explain what nationalism is, because I think to the average ear, when people like Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene extol its virtues, it sounds like patriotism. So I want to make sure that we're all starting from the same space. So what is nationalism? And then I suppose, how does it align with authoritarianism?
Sure. So as you well know, there is an enormous literature on nationalism and just about as many different definitions of nationalism as there are scholars who've written about it. But I think what's important here is to explain that nationalism and patriotism can and should be distinguished, and I think in the following way: that nationalism is allegiance to a particular ethno-cultural tribe and the dominance or rule of that tribe over a particular piece of territory. through the institutions of the state. And patriotism is devotion to a particular set of ideals. In the American case, those ideals are very clearly outlined in the founding documents. So you could say that patriotism, in a sort of sense, is sort of forward-looking. I mean, it's looking towards the realization or the pursuit of a set of shared political ideas: freedom, equality, justice, inclusion. In the American case, whereas nationalism tends to be backward-looking. It's often about sort of maintaining the sort of purity and power of the particular tribe that you believe that you belong to. So that's how I would go about distinguishing patriotism and nationalism.
So one of the things that I find fascinating about nationalism is that it is often, or it goes hand in hand with some form of authoritarianism. And I'm wondering if it has to. Does nationalism naturally lend itself to authoritarian governance, or is there something else happening here?
Well, certainly if you think of nationalism in the sense that I've defined it as a kind of a tribalism, then it's about purity, it's about boundaries, and it's about the role of hierarchy in maintaining purity and enforcing or protecting boundaries. So nationalism in the sense of tribalism, sure. I mean, I think it needs a chief or a king or a ruler. And, that's why I think that hyper-nationalist movements are almost always a very serious threat to liberal democracies, such as America's.
So I've always felt that there was some correlation between authoritarianism and, I suppose as I would term it, a virulent kind of extreme strain of Christianity. But that mainly comes from the fact that Christians adhere to a story in which there's some type of a supreme being, God, who has the final say, has to be obeyed, cannot be questioned, and will damn you to hell if you don't follow the rules. And I think to secular, specifically Blue Region Americans, or particularly Blue Region Americans, the relationship between broadly evangelicals and extremist right-wing ideologues, and here I'm thinking about followers of organizations like Proud Boys, Three Percenters, Oath Keepers, etc., seems somewhat paradoxical. To us, it's difficult to see the through line between these categories of folks. And in your research and your book, you draw a distinction that I think is key to understanding what's happening, and that's the relationship between white evangelicals and extremist right-wing ideologues. And you call this white Christian nationalism. And you build off of a concept that Arlie Hochschild relies on in, or kind of constructs in Strangers in Their Own Land, which is a deep story. So I'm wondering, what is the deep story here, and what's happening that can help us, I guess, unparadox the paradox?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, the deep story runs something like this. America was founded as a Christian nation. The founders were Orthodox Christians. The founding documents are based on Christian principles or even on divine revelation. America is a kind of chosen nation. It's been given special blessings, and in exchange, it's been given special responsibilities to spread freedom and Christianity around the world. And increasingly, the presence of non-whites, non-Christians, non-native born people on American soil threatens that mission and those blessings. And it's a deep story in a number of different senses. It's deep in the sense that it's historically deep, first of all. We trace it in the book all the way back to the second or third generation New England Puritans in the late 1600s. It's also a deep story in the sense that it's taken very deep root in American culture, so that you don't even have to be any kind of believing Christian in some sense to have been influenced by this story. The kind of secular version of it is American exceptionalism, which echoes many of these claims about America's chosenness and mission. And it's also a deep story, I think, in the sense that it's for many people of faith, it might not be something that they're sort of explicitly aware of. It's more just kind of it's not so much, it's like the lenses through which they see and perceive reality. And just, if you wear glasses, you can sometimes forget you have them on. I think that many folks who've been raised in certain milieu in the United States don't even realize that they're perceiving American politics through religious nationalist glasses.
So this nationalism has always been there, right? There's this kind of maybe not boiling, but simmering nationalism that's always been there. And I think to most folks, and maybe the argument is that we've had blinders on, it was relatively tamed or checked. And then, I think the story is that somebody, specifically Trump, comes along and really sets that to a boil. And I'm wondering if that's a fair characterization. But I guess the other question here is, had there been no Trump, what happens to that simmer? Does it just continue to simmer, or is it simmering to the point of a boil at some point and just Trump just came along?
I mean, I think both and. So I think there are certainly things that turned up the heat on the pot before Trump was standing in front of the stove. Certainly the turn towards a kind of no-holds-barred, hyper-partisan politics, it really begins, I think, arguably with Newt Gingrich played a role. 9/11 played a role. I think the end of the Cold War played a role. Mm-hmm. America has often defined itself in terms of enemies, and increasingly, without obvious external enemies, there's been an increasing focus on internal enemies, right? And then, of course, Trump came along and started, kind of, as people have often said, traded in the dog whistle for a bullhorn, and began to speak in a way that no American president had spoken for, at least 50, if not 100 years, with this kind of very explicit appeals to racism and hyper-nationalism.
Something I find fascinating about this relationship between white Christian nationalists and Trump is, and correct me if you think that I'm wrong here, is I don't know that I would characterize Donald Trump as a Christian, or at least maybe traditionally a Christian. And so I get the argument that, hitching your wagon to Trump in pursuit of an outcome is perhaps the story here. But I guess I find it particularly, confusing or confounding that Donald Trump ends up being the flag bearer of white Christian nationalism.
No doubt. I think that one of the greatest puzzles in American politics of the last decade is precisely why 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2016 and 83% again in 2020. It's not obvious why that would be. Part of it, of course, is because Trump very consciously sought an alliance with various nationally influential evangelical figures, Franklin Graham and Jerry Falwell Jr. being just the two best known and perhaps most important examples in terms of early endorsement. And once that was in place, I think there's sort of two different reads on Trump that I've run across amongst his evangelical supporters, his Christian supporters more broadly. One is there's some people who know perfectly well who he is, but they feel incredibly embattled, incredibly threatened, and they feel the need for a kind of a strongman protector, somebody who will come out swinging with no holds barred, and that's why they voted for Trump. There's another group which convinced themselves, with a little assist from people like James Dobson, that Trump was in fact some kind of a Christian, maybe a baby Christian, but definitely a Christian of some kind. And then maybe there's also a third group that was just somewhere in between those two, that was a kind of a lesser of two evils camp, which again, saw who Trump was, but held their nose and voted for him anyway, because of whatever issue motivated them. Maybe it was their anti-abortion views. Maybe it was something else. But it is sort of paradoxical. I think the part that's in a way most puzzling is the group that really somehow imagined that he really was a Christian. I think part of the explanation is that his worldview is in some ways a kind of a secular version of white Christian nationalism in many ways. He sees the world in kind of black and white, good versus evil terms. So I think for him, it's not so much good versus evil as friend versus foe. Mm. He sees people like him as marginalized, embattled, discriminated against. He has a sort of a catastrophizing view of the world, which fits very well with a kind of apocalyptic end times worldview that's very widely shared in those circles. So there are, if I can put it this way, kind of resonances between the Trumpian worldview and the deep story of Christian nationalism. So complicated, but I think there are very clear reasons why folks were attracted to him. And my own view is that an awful lot of people didn't. I think the group of people who voted for Trump as the lesser of two evils is probably the smallest group. Awful lot of conservative Christians were with Trump from the very beginning. And you can see this in the way that the GOP primaries in 2016 unfolded and, what we know about how people voted in those primaries.
Do you think the relationship between white Christian nationalists and Trump is one of purity, or is it one of, I suppose, means to an end for both sides?
Right. It depends on who you're talking to. I think that there were some who just saw him as sort of a means to an end figure. Maybe they thought about this in biblical terms, like King Cyrus, a sort of a non-Jewish defender, liberator of the Jews who restored, liberated them from their Babylonian captivity and returned them to their rightful homeland. I think some people saw it in that way. But certainly there are some who imagine that he would, drain the swamp, clean up the mess. You can certainly see this most graphically in the QAnon movement and the way in which, Trump was supposed to be, this great liberator and avenger. And there's a pretty serious constituency within the QAnon movement, which comes out of conservative Christianity.
In The Flag and the Cross, I think you make an interesting point that the Republican Party had the opportunity, and they did consider it following the 2012 election with their post-election autopsy after Mitt Romney's loss, to quote unquote grow their tent, to include groups and people that were turned off by their platform, to diversify their messaging and their voters. And instead, what they did is they doubled down on exclusion and identity politics, but they shifted their attention from maybe people of color to immigrants. And it seems to have paid some dividends. And I'm thinking of Latinos specifically here. So that being said, though, the Republican Party this year has kind of thrown all in on demonizing Black folks, and especially policies that would seem to benefit communities of color, targeting critical race theory, CRT, by example, and also queer folks with, legislation, the Don't Say Gay legislation, outlawing trans therapy, etc. And I guess the question I have then is, through the lens of your work, is this just red meat in an election year, or has the party been able to thread the needle in some enduring way?
Well, I think, Trump definitely showed that this space mobilization strategy could work, in part just given certain peculiarities about American political institutions, such as the Electoral College, certain peculiarities about American demographics, such as, the fact that the Senate represents land instead of representing population, intensifying gerrymandering and voter suppression strategies, and just saw a path forward that would not involve really significant, outreach beyond this sort of core constituency. At the same time, I think it's true that, anti-Black racism has come back with a vengeance as a sort of an ideological wedge, and they've discovered something that is Republican strategists have discovered something which I think Democratic strategists really just missed, which is that there were a lot of folks, and I would include myself, who through this sort of people of color lens imagined that Latinos were as kind of culturally unified a group as generational African Americans are, but this is simply not the case. They immigrated to the United States at different times under different circumstances. They come from different sending countries to which they have varied relations and continuing relations, none of which is really true for generational African Americans who had this searing shared experience of being cut off from their homelands, being enslaved, and then century plus of brutal repression even after the Emancipation Proclamation. So just an utterly different experience, and just realizing that there were in fact appeals that could be made to quote unquote Latinos to bring them into the Republican fold around social conservatism. I mean, the other thing, of course, that plays an important role here is the growing numbers of people in South America, Central America, and therefore also in the United States who have converted to evangelicalism and Pentecostalism because of the very, close relationship between religious conservatism and political conservatism, have been increasingly mobilized behind the Republican Party. So a bunch of different reasons why I think this is working, some institutional, some demographic, but I don't see any indication that they plan to change course in the upcoming election cycles. Quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm. And I guess following then the same line of thought, but maybe blowing it up a little bit. So in Europe, nationalist movements have been particularly successful lately by adopting a more secular approach. And we see this in the Netherlands and in France, and then to some degree in the UK and Germany, by focusing solely on immigration, specifically Muslims, and then also by jettisoning any rhetoric that marginalizes queer folks and women. And by doing this, that's allowed them to expand their appeal and their base. But that isn't true, as we've just talked about, of what's happening in the United States. So there's this same focus on immigration. It was almost a singular, policy issue for Donald Trump in 2016 as being an existential threat to the country. And in the Flag and the Cross, you mentioned that this is, essentially cloaking racism in American exceptionalism and small government conservatism. But again, as we just said, the Republican Party has chosen to double down on attacks on queer folks and Black folks and the role of women in society. And then I guess the question is, so what's their path to success? Is it simply a subversion of electoral politics and rules, which allows them to essentially cement minority rule? Or have they built a coalition that's unique to the states? And I think to some degree you answered this a bit. And then I guess the question really is, can it hold? So the reason I'm asking is because the coalition between religion and the Republican Party has always seemed so tenuous, as did the coalition between big business and the Republican Party. And we do see some strain here now. And also simply because white Christian nationalists don't represent a majority.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think it's always dangerous to make political projections based on demographic trends. That's been one of the cardinal mistakes that Democratic strategists have made over the last couple of decades. There's so many moving parts in any political coalition and in any kind of partisan competition. So it's just really hard to say whether or not this current coalition will continue to be successful in free and fair elections, and to what degree it will try to change the rules of the game so it can continue to win the game. I mean, shifting focus to Europe, there are both similarities and differences between these coalitions and strategies in the U.S. and Europe. So I think what you see in the U.S., right, is kind of white supremacism hiding behind talk of Judeo-Christian civilization, or the West, or
Mhm.
something like that, right? And I mean, you see a bit of that here too, right? Although it's less anti-black racism and more sort of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant sentiment than anything else. One of the things that's a little bit tricky about it is the way in which they talk about secularism and Christianity, right? So that the argument is, well, this is a Christian civilization, which has, historically been at odds with Islamic civilization. Christian civilization is different from Islamic civilization in the sense that it's given rise to secularism.
Mhm.
So the secularism is something that's inherently Christian, and therefore something which Muslim immigrants to Europe are incapable of adapting themselves to. And by the way, secularism also goes with sexual liberation, for example, and cultural toleration. Again, things which are supposedly anathema in an Islamic context. So it's kind of flip flopping, back and forth between a kind of a religious and a cultural, accounting or boundary that they're drawing, vis-a-vis Muslims and immigrants. And it's of course also different in the sense that the sort of leading figures here of these right-wing populist movements, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, Germany, etc.,
Mhm.
are almost never practicing Christians of any sort whatsoever,
Mhm.
and they don't make any secret. They don't make any secret out of that. But that doesn't stop them from, kind of claiming this mantle of Christianity and secularism. I think, the other thing that's really an important difference that helps explain this is that because you do still have these established churches in many parts of Protestant Europe, and because the other countries, Italy, Spain, France, so on, there's a Catholic hierarchy. You have leadership that speaks in a kind of official way in the name of Christianity, and which has almost without exception drawn a fairly sharp line vis-a-vis these right-wing, populist, anti-immigrant, hyper-nationalist movements. And you don't have that in the United States, precisely because you don't have an established church. You can have some entrepreneurial evangelical leader step up and claim to speak in the name of Christianity. And even if they don't really speak for most Christian clergy, nonetheless, kind of in the national press and the national media, those are the voices that people hear, and in particular, the voices that secular people hear. So in that sense, they are quite successful, and often in speaking in the name of conservative Christianity, but claiming to speak in the name of Christianity as such.
So I grew up in a religious family. It was non-denominational, and while the brand of it was conservative, it was dedicated mainly to, teachings of tolerance and acceptance, or living a quote unquote good life, embracing charity as not just a virtue, but an expectation, etc. But when I meet people who profess to be Christians today, they don't seem to share those same values. And this isn't to say that this is an extinct brand of Christianity, but that voice has certainly been drowned out by this Christian nationalism, or at least this contemporary Christian nationalism. So I'm wondering what's happened and how did we get here?
So I have exactly the same experience and exactly the same perception about how things have changed. I've been around a bit longer than you, so I sort of think back to kind of the mid '70s, when there were still a lot of sort of Jesus freaks running around, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was sort of even hard to, there were a lot of leftist Christians still at that point. So what's happened since then? I think in part it is the capture of conservative Christianity by the Republican Party, and the kind of reshaping of the churches as a sort of a wing of the party in many cases. Of course, there are plenty of exceptions, as you rightly note, but certainly this is kind of the most visible and most mobilized side of conservative evangelicalism, conservative Christianity today. I think it probably also does have to do with, the increasing influence of these sort of national figures, who have their own media empires, who have their own church franchises, and who are often quite ambitious people who are tightly connected to kind of networks of conservative business and political elites. And so you kind of put all that together, and I think what you really do see is the kind of the political tail is wagging the ecclesiastical dog to an incredible extent today. And that's where these shifts that we've observed come from.
And how much you've mentioned Newt Gingrich, how much responsibility for that do you lay at his feet, at least from the political side of the house?
I see him as a pretty pivotal figure. I mean, in the sense that he was really the first to kind of systematically employ kind of demonizing, othering, stigmatizing language vis-a-vis his Democratic opponents in a way that had not been done, for quite some time. I mean, he was really the first political figure who just completely broke the civil peace that had prevailed, since during the most of the post-war decades. So I do see him as a really kind of important figure in this move towards a hyper-partisan, no-holds-barred kind of politics that just seems to escalate every day.
And wrapped in the cloak of Christianity.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
So it seems as if today Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, is emerging as a credible threat to a second Trump term. And I think the narrative is that DeSantis is, in comparison to Trump, more patient, less impulsive, more intelligent, and that as a result, this makes him a graver threat to American democracy. So first, do you agree with this? And then if so, does this change your assessment of what to expect in the future? Does DeSantis appeal to the same Christian nationalist fervor as Trump does?
I don't have the measure of the guy quite yet, well enough yet to really be ready to offer an assessment like that. I mean, I think for me, there are sort of two questions. I mean, one is about how much of an institutionalist he is. That is, would he be willing to just run roughshod over all norms and rules and conventions in the way that Trump did throughout his term, culminating in the coup attempt on January 6th? I don't know. The related question is, his skill is frankly as a performer. That was a lot of Trump's appeal, is just that he was incredibly skilled as a kind of a political performer. And DeSantis may not have those skills. If he does not check both of those boxes, then I honestly would see him as somewhat less of a threat than Trump. But I think it's still too early to say. I mean, what is very clear is that, at least to me, is that there is a fairly concerted campaign going on that involves Fox News and the GOP donor class to kind of quietly push Trump to the side, maybe with an assist from the J6 committee, and to, kind of crown DeSantis as the putative 2024 GOP presidential nominee. But it's still a long way between now and then, and we'll have to see whether they succeed. A lot of the energy of Trumpism has been precisely a backlash against those very same elites. So in this case, with the help of Rupert Murdoch and Fox News. So I guess, we'll have to see whether Trump is able to fight back and without help from his friends at Fox.
Yeah, and the reason I'm asking is because it seems like what we're seeing with Trump now, and maybe this is in response to that, is that he's tacking more explicitly and closely to white Christian nationalists than he did in 2016, casting himself as almost like a savior. And I guess I'm just wondering what kind of purchase there is in that.
I do think that there is a kind of, has cast himself always in a way as a kind of a messianic savior figure, and that has always been part of his appeal. I don't know. Again, I think it's too early. It's too early to tell for me.
I feel a bit hopeless, and I think I'm not alone in this. I think a lot of people feel hopeless about our ability as secularists, as non-white Christian nationalists, to stop what seems inevitable, and that is the wholesale kind of taking and transforming of our country into an illiberal democracy, maybe at minimum. And I'm wondering how you respond to that.
Well, I'm not going to pretend that I feel particularly, optimistic about America's political future right now either. But I do think it's important that we be clear about what needs to be done. I mean, I think the first thing that needs to happen is there really does need to be kind of a popular front that runs from Bill Kristol to AOC, right? Kind of never Trumpers to Democratic socialists and everybody in between. People who may have deep disagreements about policy, but are at least in agreement about polity. That is about the importance of defending America's liberal democracy. Number two, should the Trumpified Republican Party gain control of Congress and then the White House again by 2024, then I think that the next task really is to build, local and state level, political and resistance movements, because federalism could be, the friend of the left to some degree, insofar as, there's an awful lot of, people and power and resources concentrated in blue states that will not so easily go along with a kind of attempt to impose some sort of a illiberal regime on the rest of the country from Washington, D.C. So, I mean, those to me are kind of the two main takeaways right now is, popular front and kind of local resistance. That said, I think there are some reasons, to be a little bit hopeful. I actually saw somebody, a conservative, tweet out today, "What's the matter with Kansas?" following the failure of that anti-choice constitutional referendum there in the elections yesterday. I think that there are, a lot of, younger people, including a lot of younger Christians who are frankly pretty disgusted with what's going on right now. And, there are folks out there, who are organizing very, very actively and across some of these typical dividing lines of race and religion and region in the United States. So, I don't think we should feel completely despondent, but I think we do need to be clear that, fight for liberal democracy is on, and it's going to be a tough one.
I mean, along those lines, then, do you know of any or have faith in any, no pun intended, liberals or even moderates that can somehow bring the temperature down or maybe even attract white Christian nationalists or at least cleave them in some way, maybe peel off the white supremacist contingent?
Well, I do think that there is, really active discussion going on within Christian circles right now about Christian nationalism. I mean, there are, certainly there are people who are social scientists and just, scholars who are writing about this, but there are, people who are writing about this from an evangelical perspective. So, Paul D. Miller, former Bush official, veteran, now teaches at Georgetown, has a very critical book called The Religion of American Greatness, which just came out, which is a very, explicitly theological critique of Christian nationalism. Also, the uptake of Christian Kobes de Mez's book, Jesus and John Wayne, which was on the New York Times bestseller list, is making huge waves in Christian circles. So I think that, there are reasons, again, to think that there are some folks, who are becoming more aware of the threat and more willing to kind of take a stand. And that's crucial because I think that, for an awful lot of people of faith, they're not going to listen to it, a sociologist from Yale, right? I mean, they're going to be much more apt to listen to, a neighbor, somebody who's, in their church, who shares a lot of their commitments. And I think there are more and more people like that. So, those are some reasons why, I think we should remain hopeful, if not necessarily optimistic.
So then on that note, what's something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately? And it doesn't have to be related to this topic.
Well, I'll just sort of give a quick, little plug for my next project, which is a very different one. And that is returning to this question I've been thinking about for decades now about, secularization, and increasingly coming to the view that there's something just fundamentally wrong about the secularization narrative that circulates inside and outside of academic circles. The kind of the catchphrases or that kind of capture the academic common wisdom here are differentiation, disenchantment, rationalization, all taken, of course, from the great German sociologist Max Weber and his now a century-old essays in the sociology of religion. And this seems to me to prove in many ways kind of a profound misdiagnosis of, at least of our times, where what one sees is not a differentiation between religion, science, and culture, but increasingly their mixture and intermixture. I would just point to QAnon as a great example of this. Not so much the triumph of scientific rationality as kind of the return of various kinds of magic and mysticism and mythology, and not just amongst sort of fringe segments, but even amongst the putative bearers of or carriers of scientific rationality, namely the educated upper middle classes who, they've got their yoga mats and their goop, and maybe they're reading privately an astrology column, and so on and so forth. And so that's what I'm thinking about right now. And as a sort of a teaser, let me just close out by saying that I think that the civilization that seems to me to most nearly resemble our own is not, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, but 2,000 years ago, namely pre-Christian Rome. In the sense of the raging. We live in a world filled with gods instead of a world ruled by a single god now. That at least channeling another Max Weber observation about the modern age being a polytheistic one.
Well, I mean, we saw how that turned out.
We saw how that turned out, yeah.
Dr. Gorski, thanks for taking some time to talk to me about this today. I've enjoyed it.
Me too. Thanks for having me on, Sean.
So I think I have a better understanding between my conversations with Dr. Hochschild last week and Dr. Gorski today of not only what this conservative Trump coalition really looks like, but how it came to be and what motivates it, at least in part. To be honest, I'm still a little bit stunned, might be the word, that Christians seem so comfortable sharing coalitional space with white supremacists and anti-Semites. But if there's a shared end, a shared goal that is so deeply rooted in their sense of being and identity, then I can kind of wrap my head around it. I think the bigger question for me is this: is there a way to meet those needs of these Christians that could bring them back into a fold that embraces liberal democracy and liberal policies, fully recognizing that this might also require some soul searching, no pun intended, on the part of the far left, of liberals. But I do think there is some natural shared space here that's being overlooked by both liberals and Christians. Dr. Gorski mentions the need for a broad coalition of folks that includes never-Trumpers and the far left that acts as a cohesive backstop against the wholesale dissolution of American democracy as we know it under Trumpism. This is a perfectly rational, maybe effective tactic that's gaining at least theoretical traction, and I'm on board. But here's my concern. I wonder if this is also the type of thing that is ultimately effective at derailing the Trump train, but also has the effect of dragging the center of the entire policy debate to the right. And then, in the long run, how good is that for the majority of Americans that seem to be more aligned with center-left policy than center-right? I guess the question is, what's more immediately important at this moment in time? How will history judge what we do now? Okay, so next week, I close out this series by taking this conversation global. The United States is not alone in experiencing this democratic backslide. We're seeing it in Australia and South Africa, in the Philippines, and Europe, places like France, the Netherlands, UK, Italy, Denmark. But it seems to me that while the objectives may be the same across these countries, the United States has created a far-right, anti-democratic coalition that is comprised of different types of supporters than we see in other places. And I'm interested in further understanding both the similarities and the differences, as well as if we can discern some type of pattern at the international level that helps us to understand this movement and maybe prepare to counter it in a meaningful way, a way that is not about conquering people, but meeting needs and tending to concerns in a constructive and thoughtful way. So, I'll be talking to Dr. Sasha Polikow-Saransky, a journalist and the deputy editor of Foreign Policy magazine. His book, Go Back to Where You Came From, is a fascinating and devastating critique of anti-immigrant sentiment at the global level, but also a very thoughtful and humanely crafted policy map, almost manifesto, to untethering ourselves from xenophobic and nationalist policies that undermine our commitments to liberal democracy. In the meantime, as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, you can email me at deepdiveWithSean@gmail.com. And you can find me on Twitter at DeepDiveSean and on Instagram at DeepDiveWithSean. Chat soon, folks.